This story comes from a file so disturbing that the state archivist who first uncovered it needed 3 days before he could read the full report. A case sealed for over 100 years. A barn hidden deep in the West Virginia wilderness. And 37 men who vanished without a trace until investigators made the most horrifying discovery in the region's history. Tonight, we're opening that file. We're walking into that barn, and we're exposing the truth behind the Pike Sisters. 2 women whose crimes were so monstrous, the newspapers of the time refused to print the details. This is the side of American history you were never meant to hear. The night the curse stirred awake again, the moon hung over Black Hollow like a sick, pale eye, wide open, unblinking. Cold winds slithered down the hills, slipping between the trees like it was searching for something or someone. The Pike property sat isolated at the bottom of the valley, abandoned for years, or so everyone believed. No one talked about the place anymore. Not since 1891. Not since the first bodies were found. But on this night, lanterns flickered inside the barn for the first time in a decade. Sheriff Abram Calder watched from the ridge, his horse trembling beneath him. His breath turned white in the cold as he lowered his spyglass. The barn's windows, long boarded over, now glowed as though fire burned inside. But there was no crackling, no smoke. Just pulsing light, a heartbeat of flame. Slow, heavy. Wrong, Calder swallowed. Every instinct told him to turn around, but he had come looking for a missing man. Elias Hart, a trapper who never came home. His last known location? Walking toward the Pike Woods. And now the barn was alive again. He nudged his horse forward. As he approached, he noticed the air shift, warm then freezing, like the weather couldn't make up its mind. The trees around the barn leaned inward, as if listening. Calder pulled his revolver, though he knew metal wasn't much protection against whatever the Pike sisters had brought into the world. He touched the barn door. It throbbed. Actually throbbed, like veins pulsed behind the wood. Calder's heartbeat stuttered. Inside, something dragged across the floor, slow, heavy, rhythmic. Chains rattled once, then fell silent. The sheriff took a breath, pushed the door open, and stepped into the unnatural glow. The barn smelled of earth, rot, and something older, ancient, like wet stone deep underground. Lanterns hung from rafters, but their flames didn't flicker normally. Instead, they rose and fell in perfect rhythm, like they were breathing with the barn itself. Calder's boots squelched. He looked down. Not mud. Not blood. Something thicker, like the floor had sweated. He raised his lantern and froze. The 3 Pike sisters stood in the center of the barn, facing away from him. Their hair hung in tangled black knots. Their dresses were filthy, torn, stiff with soil and something darker. They stood unnaturally still, too still, like their bodies were holding a pose forced upon them. Around them, carved into the barn floor, was an enormous symbol, circles within circles, intersecting lines, something that hurt to look at too long. The markings weren't etched with tools. They were scratched by fingernails. The sisters spoke in unison, low. Hoarse, not entirely human. You shouldn't have come, Sheriff Calder. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't made a sound, but they answered him anyway. Calder raised the lantern higher. Where is Elias Hart? The sisters' heads turned slightly, only enough for him to see the corners of their mouths curl upward. Not smiles. Something colder. Something resigned. One sister stepped forward, Mary Pike, the eldest. He heard the whispers in the soil, she said. Just as we did. Just as you are hearing them now. Calder stiffened. He didn't want to admit it, but he had been hearing something. Soft, low, a voice like wind whispering from under the floorboards. Another sister, Laura, tilted her head. Once you hear the land calling, Sheriff, it never lets you leave. The barn's lanterns dimmed. The air thickened. The symbol on the floor pulsed once, like it had a heartbeat. Calder stepped back, instinctively. Mary Pike looked over her shoulder just enough for him to see her eyes. They were black, not the pupils, her entire eyes. We didn't choose this, she whispered. The hollow chooses who it needs. Something dragged in the shadows behind them, something alive. Calder's hand tightened on his gun. What did you do to Elias? Laura's voice quivered like she was suppressing terror. We tried to warn him. Truly we did. But the hollow must be fed. The floorboards creaked, and in the darkness behind the sisters, a chained figure moved, slowly stepping forward into the light. Calder's stomach turned. It wasn't Elias Hart. It wasn't anyone human anymore. It was something shaped like a man, but hollow-cheeked, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bones, like the life had been drained out and replaced with something vicious and starving. Its wrists were raw from chains. It breathed in sudden jerks, like each inhale hurt. Mary whispered toward the creature, "Be still." The thing shuddered. But it obeyed. Calder's instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay, his voice shaking. "What the hell is that?" Mary turned fully now. Tears tracked down her filthy cheeks. "Her brother," she whispered. The first the curse took, Calder felt the blood drain from his face. The creature stared at him, head twitching, nostrils flaring as if smelling his fear, and the sisters said those words that would haunt him until the night he died. "It's hungry again." The chains snapped. Calder fired, once, twice, 3 times. But the lantern light died in a single pulse as the thing lunged out of the darkness. The barn door slammed behind him, and Black Hollow swallowed his scream. The sun hadn't yet risen when the search party reached the ridge overlooking Black Hollow. 12 men, rifles slung over their shoulders, trudged silently through the mist. The horses didn't want to come this far. Every step was a fight, so the men walked the last half-mile on foot. The valley breathed a cold they'd never felt before. Not winter cold, grave cold. The kind that crept under the skin like icy fingers. Deputy Titus Greeley led the line, boots crunching dead leaves. He'd been up all night waiting for Sheriff Calder to return, pacing the station floor until he finally roused a group of locals. Calder had never failed to come home. Until now, and everyone knew which place he'd gone to. The Pike farm. As they reached the ridge, Greeley raised a fist. The men froze. Down below, smoke curled from the chimney of the Pike house, thin, gray, unnatural. No one had lived there for years. The shutters were broken, the windows hollowed out. But there it was, the unmistakable flicker of fire inside. Greeley's heart thudded. Then they heard it. A screaming. Broken, raw, wrong. Not human. Not anymore. The men exchanged terrified glances. Greeley swallowed. "That wasn't a fox," he muttered. "That was something else." No one answered. A second scream burst from the valley. Closer now. It rattled the leaves. A few of the horses on the ridge reared violently, nearly tearing free from their reins. Greeley didn't wait. "Move!" They descended quickly, rifles ready. The closer they got, the worse the air felt, heavy like smoke, but cold enough to sting their noses. The ground was soft, almost spongy, as if the soil had been soaked but there'd been no rain. When they reached the barn, the door hung crooked, one hinge ripped clean off. Fresh splinters littered the ground, and on the threshold, streaked across the wood, was a long smear of blood. Not dried, not sticky. Still warm. Greeley whispered, "Sheriff." He stepped forward, lantern raised. The smell hit them first. Rot. Dirt. Something sweet and sour, like fruit left in the sun too long. But darker. Older. The kind of smell that made the stomach instinctively clench. Inside, the barn was dim, the lanterns on the rafters barely glowing. Greeley lifted his own light and froze as the beam hit the carved sigil on the floor. The symbol was deeper now. Wider. Expanded, like it had grown overnight. And the wood around it still pulsed. The men behind him murmured, "Jesus Christ." "What the hell is that?" "Titus, we should leave." "We should." Movement. Fast. Behind them, the men spun, rifles rising. Something crawled across the rafters, too quick, too light for something human. Its limbs bent wrong, angles too sharp, body too thin. It clung to the beams with long fingers and toes, skin stretched tight, ribs poking against flesh. Its eyes reflected lantern light. Black. Hungry. Knowing. Every man aimed at once. It hissed, low, guttural, vibrating the air. Greeley whispered, "That's no animal." The creature dropped, right onto one of the men. Its weight slammed him into the dirt. The man's scream was short, cut off suddenly as his body convulsed under the creature's feverish movements. Chaos exploded. 2 men fired, bullets ripping through the barn beams. Another stumbled backward and fell into the carved sigil. It pulsed faster, lighting up like ember veins. Greeley raised his rifle and fired. The creature jerked, spine snapping backward in an unnatural arch. But it didn't fall. It twisted its head slowly toward Greeley, lockjawed grin spreading across its skeletal face. Its mouth opened, and in the flicker of the lantern light, Greeley saw the truth. This wasn't just any creature. Worse than an animal. Worse than a monster. Greeley recognized the jawline. The scar across the cheek. The hair. What was left of it. It was Sheriff Calder, or what was left of him. The creature lunged, faster than a man could react. Greeley fired again, the shot grazing its shoulder. It screeched, the sound sharp enough to split the air, then scurried up the wall like a spider, disappearing into the rafters. The barn groaned, the sigil throbbed. The ground beneath the men shifted. One of them, Jeb Hollow, whispered, "The floor's movin'." The goddamn floor. Before he could finish, a hand shot up from the soil, thin, pale, trembling, grabbing his ankle. He screamed as he was yanked downward. The dirt sucked him in like water. Another hand emerged. Then another. Dozens. Grasping. Pulling. The men backed away, slipping in blood and mud. Greeley shouted, "Outside! Get outside! Move!" They sprinted for the door, but the soil churned beneath them like something alive, something hungry. Hands clawed at boots, at pant legs, at flesh. 2 more men went down, dragged screaming into the churning earth. Greeley leaped over the threshold, grabbing the last man by the collar and pulling him free. They tumbled into the cold morning air just as the barn door slammed shut behind them, not by wind, not by hinges, but as if the barn itself exhaled. Inside, the screams continued for several seconds, then stopped. Total silence. Greeley sat in the dirt, chest heaving, staring at the barn in horror, and that was when he saw them. Standing on the hill above the barn, 3 silhouettes, still, watching. The Pike Sisters. Their hair blew in the wind, their dresses clung to their thin frames. Their faces were pale, expressionless. The eldest, Mary, raised a hand, not waving, not greeting. Warning! Her voice carried through the valley, soft but clear. "You can't save them, deputy. The land has already decided." The other sisters spoke together, their voices layered and hollow. "And it has chosen you next." The wind died. The valley fell silent, and the barn's lanterns flickered back to life, bright and blood red. The world felt wrong. Deputy Titus Greeley stood frozen, staring at the ridge where the Pike Sisters had appeared. But now the hilltop was empty. The 3 silhouettes were gone, as if they had never been there at all. The trees stood motionless. The valley swallowed their presence like a secret. The surviving men behind Greeley were trembling, smeared with dirt, blood, and cold sweat. None spoke. None dared. Greeley forced himself to breathe, but even the air tasted tainted, metallic, old, like the inside of a coffin. He rose slowly, legs shaking. We're going back," he said. Nobody moved. "Don't make me say it again." Finally, 2 stepped forward, Clay Mercer and Tom Braddock, men who had hunted bear and wolf their whole lives, but nothing had ever put fear into their bones like what they'd seen inside that barn. Greeley scanned the valley. "The rest of you get back to town. Raise the militia. Bring torches and dynamite." The men hesitated. "Go!" They ran. Anything to get away from the barn, the sigil, the hands in the dirt. The screams already burned into their skulls. When they were finally gone, only Greeley, Mercer, and Braddock remained at the edge of the property. The barn doors creaked open again. Just an inch. Just enough. A lantern inside flickered, redder than before. Braddock whispered, "Titus, that ain't fire in there." "Fire don't glow like that." Greeley already knew. The red was too deep. Too alive. Too aware. He took a step closer, rifle ready. "Sheriff Calder was in there," he said quietly. "What's left of him is still in there, and whatever did that is still hungry." They moved toward the barn cautiously, boots sinking into soft soil. Each step felt heavier, and then the ground trembled. Just once, a slow thud, as if something massive shifted beneath them. Mercer's voice cracked. What if the men who got dragged under, they're still alive under there?" Greeley didn't answer, because he'd thought the same thing. Because he could almost feel something breathing under the dirt. Because the ground was warm. He wiped sweat from his forehead. This wasn't natural. This wasn't human. But it wasn't a ghost story either. This was alive. When they reached the barn door, it swung open silently, almost inviting them in. Greeley raised a lantern. Inside, the red glow pulsed like a heartbeat. And hanging from the rafters were more lanterns. Dozens of them. All glowing red. But they weren't lanterns. They were skulls. Men's skulls. Hung by rusted wire. Candles melted into the hollows. Wax dripped down bone-like tears. Braddock covered his mouth. Sweet God. Mercer took a step back, shaking. "This is witchcraft." "Has to be." Greeley moved deeper inside, light trembling in his hand. That symbol on the floor, look, the carved sigil, the one from before, had changed again. It was bigger. Wider. The grooves deeper. Freshly dug. As if some enormous tool, or claw, had scraped it open. And now blood pooled in the channels, filling the symbol like a bowl. Braddock's voice broke. "That's not from animals." Greeley crouched. Touched the edge. It was warm, warmer than skin. Mercer whispered, "Something's under the barn. Something's feeding." A floorboard creaked behind them. All 3 men whipped around. Someone stood at the entrance. A girl, pale. Barefoot, hair down to her shoulders. Not a Pike sister. Younger, frail. Her dress was torn. Dirty. Stained with something dark. She stared at them with hollow, shining eyes. Greeley stepped forward. "Are you hurt?" "What's your name?" Her lips parted, and then another voice spoke through her. Older. Darker. Not human. You shouldn't have come back." The girl blinked. Her irises flickered red, and then she collapsed to the floor like a puppet whose strings were cut. Greeley ran to her, checked her pulse. Alive. Barely. "We need to get her out of here," he said. "Now." But when they lifted her, the ground inside the sigil began to sink. Slowly at first, then faster, as though the whole barn floor was breathing in. Mercer shouted, "It's pulling the air! Move!" They rushed toward the exit, the girl limp in Greeley's arms. Behind them, the soil churned again. Hands, too many to count, reached up from the earth, clawing, grabbing, straining, and beneath all the hands, something bigger rose. A shape, massive, featureless, like a body made of soil and blood. Braddock screamed, "Run!" They burst out of the barn just as the ground collapsed inward behind them. The entire floor caved, dropping into a dark pit that hadn't been there moments ago. A howl rose from the depths, deep, animalistic, echoing. The barn shook, the ridge shook, even the trees trembled, and then the howl stopped. The silence afterward was worse. Greeley looked at the unconscious girl in his arms. "What are you?" he whispered. Her eyelids twitched. Then slowly, she smiled, a tiny, unnatural, knowing smile. Through cracked lips, she whispered 5 words. "They're not done with you." And from the woods behind them, 3 voices answered in eerie harmony. "The Pike Sisters. We never are." The storm that night rolled over the Appalachian hills like a living creature, slow, heavy, and breathing. Sheriff Alden Crow had always believed the mountains held secrets, but nothing compared to what he was about to uncover. He reached the edge of the Pike property just as the last sliver of daylight drained behind the ridge. His boots sank into the mud. The trees swayed unnaturally, as if warning him to turn back. But he kept walking, clutching the lantern in one hand and his revolver in the other. The barn stood at the far end of the clearing. Tall, crooked, and sagging like a dying animal. Its wood was blackened from years of rot. No sound came from inside, yet the air pulsed with presence, as if something inside was awake. Watching, Alden stepped forward. A single rusted horseshoe hung over the barn door, but it was flipped upside down, letting the luck spill out. The Pike sisters believed it kept spirits from escaping. Locals believed the same thing kept evil from leaking out. He placed his hand on the door. The wood was warm. Too warm. Like something inside was breathing against it. The sheriff's heart began pounding. Not from fear, but from the unmistakable scent drifting out through the cracks. Sweat, iron, and old blood. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed like a dying man. For a moment, the darkness inside was complete. Crushing. As if the barn had swallowed all light. But then, slowly, Alden raised the lantern. And the chains began to sing. A low metallic clinking echoed across the rafters. It didn't come from movement. No one inside was shifting or pulling. The chains just trembled on their own as if reacting to the light. Or reacting to him. Alden's breath hitched. Then the lantern's glow fell on them. Row after row of men. Skin pale. Eyes hollow. Bodies broken. Some were kneeling. Some were slumped forward. Some stared into nothingness like their souls had wandered out years ago. Every one of them chained like livestock. For a long moment, Alden couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. 37 men. 37 missing souls. Every disappearance from the last 8 years laid out before him like an exhibit of human suffering. And then he saw her, standing in the far corner, watching him silently. Ada Pike. Her silhouette was unmistakable. Long hair braided down her back, apron stained with something far darker than dirt. Her boots coated in mud that looked suspiciously like dried blood. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't smile. She just stared, as though she'd been waiting for him. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff," Ada whispered. Her voice was calm. Too calm, almost gentle, until the lantern's light caught her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a human anymore. They looked wild, hungry, starving. Alden tried to raise his gun, but a movement in the rafters stopped him. Then another thud. And another, slow, purposeful, the sound of bare feet creeping along the beams. Alden tilted the lantern upward. And froze. It wasn't one of the sisters. It was a man. Or what was left of one. Naked, skin stretched tight, bones jutting out. His body covered in bite marks that were clearly human. His pupils were blown wide, black and bottomless like a feral animal. A metal collar was locked around his throat, with a broken chain dangling down like a tail. He crouched like a predator. Then he opened his mouth. and hissed. Alden stumbled backward, and behind him, 37 chains jerked in unison, not by accident, not by wind, but as if some invisible command had passed through the barn. The men began to rise. Their bones cracked. Their jaws slackened. Their eyes rolled. They weren't missing men anymore. They were something else. Something made. Something broken and rebuilt. A breeding stock turned into creatures of pure torment. Alden's hand shook violently. Ada Pike stepped closer, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "You see?" she whispered. "You didn't save him. You woke him." The lantern flickered. The barn breathed. And every single chained man took a step toward him. Alden fired his gun. But the shot didn't stop them. It only made them faster. The storm outside roared. The chains erupted like thunder. And in that moment, Sheriff Alden Crow finally understood why no one ever escaped the Pike Sisters' property. The barn itself didn't just hold monsters. It made them. The moment Alden Price slipped out of the breeding barn, the cold air hit him like a slap. The night was dead quiet, too quiet for a place where more than 30 men had been kept like animals. The moon hovered low, swallowed by clouds, as if even the sky didn't want to see what stood on that abandoned piece of land. Alden's boots sank into the damp dirt as he crept toward the old Pike farmhouse. Its silhouette rose like a broken jaw against the tree line, windows boarded, roof sagging, front porch collapsing under its own memories. But buried beneath that decay was something else, something alive. He felt it, a pulse, not from inside the barn, but from inside the house. A slow, rhythmic throb, like a heartbeat working under the floorboards. The sisters called this place home, but Alden could tell immediately that the barn was only the beginning. Whatever the sisters were doing didn't start with the men in chains. It started here, inside these rotting walls. He gripped his lantern tighter, breath fogging in front of him, and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not animal, but something chemical. Preservatives, oils, stale perfumes, and underneath that, iron. Thick iron. Like blood soaked into wood for decades and refusing to let go. Alden raised the lantern. Shadows writhed across peeling wallpaper. The floor creaked under his weight like bones shifting. The front room was empty. But the house wasn't silent. There was a faint whisper, not a voice, a movement, a soft dragging like bare feet sliding across the floor. Slow, careful, ritualistic. Alden followed the sound, down the hallway, past rooms with shredded curtains. Past framed photographs of girls who looked like the Pike sisters, but younger, healthier, smiling in ways that felt wrong now. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall. Not just a door sealed, ropes tied across it, rusty padlocks, symbols carved directly into the wood. Unfamiliar. Violent. Almost primitive. But the strangest part? The inside of the door glowed. A faint, reddish light pulsed from the cracks, syncing with that same heartbeat he felt outside. Thump, thump. Thump. Alden swallowed hard, hands trembling as he cut the rope and forced the door open. It swung inward with a sigh, as if the house itself exhaled. Then the lantern light fell inside, and the sheriff froze. The ritual room, the walls were covered in drawings, hundreds of them, scratched with fingernails, knives, and broken glass. The artwork was chaotic and obsessive. Symbols, spirals, figures with elongated limbs, women with swollen bellies, creatures being born, men chained to posts, faces screaming, and at the center of the room, a wooden table, strapped and stained. The sisters had used this room for more than ceremonies. It was a workshop of horrors. Jars lined the shelves, filled with preserved organs, clumps of braided hair, glassy eyeballs suspended in amber liquids. Every jar had a date. Some as old as 1874. Some as recent as last month. Alden's stomach twisted. This wasn't just cruelty. This wasn't just isolation madness. This was systematic, organized, a method passed down, a family tradition. On the far wall he found a book, a ledger, handwritten, Pike bloodline record, keeping our legacy strong. His hands hesitated before opening it. Inside there were names, men's names, dates, methods, observations, and worst outcomes. Some men died, some survived until they served their purpose. Some produced offspring. The last pages detailed experiments, attempts to shape the next generation, attempts to create something stronger, attempts at improving the male stock. Alden's pulse hammered in his ears. This wasn't a simple kidnapping operation. The Pike sisters were trying to breed something, not human, not fully. He turned to leave, but froze. because something in the corner moved. He lifted the lantern, its flame trembling. There was a figure crouched there, skin gray, spine bent, hair long and matted like roots soaked in swamp water. It looked almost human, but its eyes were too wide, too reflective, catching the lantern light like an animal's. It stared at Alden. Then it smiled. A wet, unnatural stretch. Alden stumbled back, horror ripping through him. This creature, whatever it was, had been born here, raised here, and it was waiting, not for escape, but for its mothers, the Pike Sisters. Alden turned to run, but behind him, footsteps echoed. Light, bare, female, and a voice whispered, "Sheriff, why are you in our nursery?" Alden Price spun around so fast his lantern nearly slipped from his hand. The Pike Sisters stood in the doorway, not hiding, not attacking, just watching him. 3 women, tall, gaunt, dresses stained with something dark and dried, eyes wide and gleaming with the kind of excitement most people reserve for Christmas morning. Eleanor Pike stepped forward first, her hair braided tight, her smile stretched too far. "You weren't invited inside," she whispered, voice dripping with a strange sweetness. "Guests don't come into the nursery." The creature in the corner made a soft, shivering sound, almost like a baby learning how to breathe. The sisters' eyes flicked toward it in unison, the way a mother might check on her sleeping child. Alden backed up, gun trembling in his hand. "Stay where you are." Eleanor didn't stop. She tilted her head like she was amused. "Sheriff, you don't want to point that at us. You'll wake the little ones." Alden swallowed hard. "One of the men escaped. He told me everything. What you did to them. What you're breeding." At the word breeding, the sisters' smiles widened. Abigail Pike, shorter but with a sharper jaw and eyes like cracked ice, stepped beside Eleanor. "Men are useful," she said softly. For a while, Margaret, the eldest and tallest, placed a hand on the wall beside her. Her fingers brushed over the drawings carved into the wood, spirals and faces and symbols that looked more like warnings than art. "Our family's work began long before you were born," she murmured. "Long before this town even existed." Alden steadied his gun. "What the hell are you? What are those things you're growing?" Margaret's expression slowly shifted, something between pride and hunger. "We are mothers," she said. "And they are the future." The creature in the corner hissed, its spine lifting, vertebrae crackling like twigs snapping. Alden took a step back, fear choking him. Eleanor's voice softened, like she was soothing a frightened child. "Don't mind him. He's only half-grown." Half-grown? The thing was the size of a full-grown man, and it looked like it had chewed its way out of nightmares. Alden cocked his gun. "Move away from the door. All of you." Abigail's smile vanished. In a blink, her expression turned cold, like frost spreading across a window. "You don't understand," she said. "We don't hurt people." She took a step closer. "We use them." Alden fired. The gunshot exploded through the room, deafening in the small space. Abigail jerked, but not the way a normal person would. She didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, a slow, crooked grin spreading across her face. The bullet had lodged in her shoulder, but she didn't bleed. She didn't even flinch. Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh, Sheriff, we stopped being like other women a long time ago." The creature in the corner screeched. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something new, a blend of both. Alden's survival instincts roared. He turned and ran, down the hallway, past the broken photos, past the scratching symbols, lantern light bouncing wildly. Behind him, the sisters moved, not running, but following, slowly, calmly, confident, as if they already knew. There was no way out. Alden reached the front door just as a shape lunged out of the darkness. Not a sister, not a creature. Something bigger, something that filled the doorway. A massive hunched figure, skin pale as bone, mouth torn too wide, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Another one of their children, fully grown. Alden staggered backward, breath ripping from his lungs. The sisters stepped into view behind him. Margaret spoke first. "Sheriff, you've seen our nursery." Eleanor's voice dripped with joy. "But now you'll see our legacy." Abigail leaned in close, whispering into Alden's ear, her breath cold as winter. "You're not leaving this house." Alden raised his gun with shaking hands, but the towering creature lunged before he could fire. The last thing he saw was its mouth, opening wider than anything human should be able to. And then darkness swallowed him. Alden Price woke to the sound of dripping, slow, steady, like water leaking through stone. But when he opened his eyes, he realized it wasn't water. It was blood. A thin, glistening line ran down the wall beside him, disappearing into the packed dirt floor. The air was thick, humid, warm and sour with the smell of rotting wood and something far worse. Alden tried to move. Chains clattered. His wrists were bound. His ankles, too. He was lying on a damp stone slab, deep underground. The ceiling was low, covered in roots and hanging strips of cloth. No, not cloth skin. He pulled against the chains so hard his wrists burned. That's when he heard it. A breathing sound. Multiple breathing sounds. All around him. Shallow. Wet. Uneven. Dozens of them. He lifted his head. And froze. They were everywhere. Shapes crouched in the dark. Some tall. Some small. None of them human. Their eyes glowed a soft, animalistic amber in the dim light. Their limbs bent wrong. Their ribs stuck out like bony cages. Some had mouths too wide, others had no mouths at all. And not one of them blinked. They were watching him, waiting. Alden's chest tightened. Where the hell am I? A lantern flickered on behind him. Footsteps followed. Soft, bare, light as dust. The Pike sisters stepped into the underground chamber. Eleanor first, her smile bright, like she was welcoming guests to a Sunday picnic. "Welcome to the root cellar, Sheriff." Abigail brushed her fingers along the wall, tracing symbols carved into the stone. Spirals, crosses turned sideways, stick figures with hollow eyes. "Our great-grandmother built this place," she said. "She believed the earth could grow more than crops." Margaret came last, holding a rusted iron bucket. Something inside it twitched. She set it down at the foot of Alden's slab. A sickening scraping sound echoed. What do you want from me?" Alden whispered. Eleanor stepped closer. "You're a strong man." Her voice was calm. Too calm. "And strong men have uses." The creatures around them shifted, their bodies making faint clicking sounds, like bones grinding against each other. Alden pulled at his chains, voice cracking. "You're monsters, all of you. You're breeding monsters." Abigail smiled, crouching beside him. "We don't breed monsters." She leaned in. "We breed survivors." Margaret lifted the bucket. Alden's stomach turned. Inside was a sack, wet, pulsing, like an enormous blood-filled organ. Something inside it kicked. Hard. Eleanor's eyes glowed with excitement. "This one needs a father." Alden thrashed so violently the slab shook. "No, N-O, don't." Abigail tightened the restraints. "You humans always fight," she sighed. "You never understand our purpose." Margaret lifted the pulsing sack above Alden's chest. "Life grows where blood is strong," she whispered. The sack split. Not with a pop, with a slow, tearing rip. Thick fluid spilled over Alden's chest and shoulders, warm, slimy, suffocating. A small, malformed limb pushed out, twitching. Alden screamed. The creatures around him began to hiss, low, rhythmic, like they were chanting. Eleanor touched Alden's forehead. Her fingers were icy. "Don't be afraid," she said gently. "Birth is always messy." The tiny creature inside the sack pushed its head out. A skull too large, eyes sealed shut, mouth opening and closing like a newborn animal searching for its mother. Alden sobbed, shaking uncontrollably. Please, don't do this." Abigail tilted her head. "But you're already part of the family," she whispered. "You entered the house." Margaret lowered the creature toward Alden's chest. Suddenly something boomed above them. A deep crash. Dust rained from the ceiling. The creatures hissed, startled. Eleanor stiffened. "What was that?" Abigail gasped. Another crash, then shouting. Men's voices. Torches. Weapons. Dogs. Margaret snarled under her breath. "They've come for him." Alden's heart surged. Hope. Real hope. For the first time, Eleanor's face twisted into rage. "No one takes what belongs to us." Abigail grabbed a rusted blade from the wall. "Seal the tunnel," she ordered. "Kill anyone who enters." Margaret shoved the half-born creature back into the sack, tying it tight. "We'll finish the ritual later." The sisters disappeared into the shadows, up the narrow earthen steps, leaving Alden alone, surrounded by creatures waiting for their next command. And above him, a war was about to begin. The pounding grew louder, boots on rotting floorboards, shouts echoing through the Pike farmhouse like thunder. Alden could hear it all, muffled through layers of dirt and stone. "Sheriff Price! If you're down there, shout!" It was Deputy Harlan's voice. Alden forced air into his lungs. "Harlan! Down here!" But the creatures, dozens of them, hissed at once, drowning him out. Their glowing eyes fixed on the staircase as the boards above splintered under heavy weight. Alden tried again, screaming until his throat tore. "Down here!" A sharp snap cracked the air. The trapdoor above exploded inward. Light spilled down the narrow stairwell. Gun barrels gleamed. 6 men stormed in, torches raised, and the creatures reacted instantly. They launched out of the shadows. Like wolves. But faster. Twisting. Leaping. Crawling across walls and ceilings as if gravity meant nothing. Deputy Harlan fired first. His shotgun blast lit up the cellar like lightning, shredding one creature mid-air. Its body smacked against the stone and slid down in a heap of bone and wet muscle. Another creature landed on a torch, catching fire, shrieking like something pulled out of hell. "Keep moving," Harlan yelled. "Get to the sheriff." The men advanced, forming a tight line, flames pushing back the swarm. The little monsters clawed and lunged, teeth snapping, limbs bending in grotesque angles. Alden watched, trembling, as the men fought their way through the nightmare. Then, from above, a scream. Not a creature this time. Human. High, sharp, full of terror. The Pike Sisters. Deputy Collins shouted from the stairs. "They're upstairs! They're coming!" 3 shapes blurred past the opening, faster than any human should move. The Pike Sisters dropped into the cellar like bats diving into a cave. Eleanor landed silently. Abigail crouched, smiling. Margaret still smeared with birthing fluids, breathing hard, eyes wild. Deputy Harlan lifted his shotgun. "Don't you move." Eleanor's voice was soft. "This is our home." Abigail's voice sharper. "And he is ours." Margaret pointed to Alden. "I will finish what we started." Alden screamed, thrashing against the chains. "Don't let them touch me." The creatures surged again. Deputy Harlan fired both barrels into the mass. Deputy Collins threw a torch into the swarm, catching 3 on fire. Another hunter swung a machete, cutting through wet flesh. But Eleanor moved like smoke. She lunged, grabbing Collins by the face. Her fingers sank into his cheeks. She twisted. His neck snapped with a wet crunch. She dropped him like a broken doll. "You can't stop us," she hissed. Deputy Harlan roared and charged with his knife, slashing Eleanor across the shoulder. She shrieked, more animal than human, and fell back. Abigail attacked next, tackling one of the hunters and tearing into his throat with her teeth. Blood sprayed across the wall. Margaret sprinted toward Alden. "No, oh no," he screamed. But a hunter intercepted her with a burning torch, slamming it into her chest. Her dress caught fire instantly. Margaret screamed and stumbled back into the pit of creatures. They swarmed her, tearing, eating. Eleanor shrieked in horror. Abigail's eyes filled with rage. Deputy Harlan raised his shotgun again, aiming at Alden's chains. "Sheriff, cover your eyes." A blast. Sparks flew. Alden's wrist shackle snapped open. Another shot. The second chain broke. Alden collapsed to the dirt, gasping, finally free. Eleanor launched at Harlan. But Alden grabbed a broken chain from the floor and swung it with every ounce of strength he had left. The chain wrapped around Eleanor's throat. She clawed at it, hissing, choking, her eyes glowing brighter and brighter. Alden pulled hard, harder, until her neck snapped sideways. Her body dropped, twitched, went still. The remaining creatures shrieked in panic and scattered into cracks in the stone. Abigail backed toward the stairs, bleeding from multiple wounds. "You don't understand," she rasped. "We're the only thing keeping this forest alive." Deputy Harlan raised his shotgun. Alden stepped in front of him, voice low, shaking with fury. "You killed 37 men." Abigail's smile widened, smeared with blood. "And we made so many more." Alden threw the burning lantern at her. It smashed against her chest. Fire engulfed her instantly. She screamed, a burning silhouette flailing, collapsing on the stairs, until the flames consumed the last of her voice. Silence fell. No more breathing, no more hissing, only the crackle of fire. Deputy Harlan put a hand on Alden's shoulder. "Let's get you out of here." Alden stared at the darkness where the creatures had fled. "Them too," he whispered. "We have to burn all of it." Harlan nodded, and together, limping and blood-soaked, they climbed the stairs toward the cold West Virginia night. Behind them, the root cellar burned. But within the walls, deep behind the stone, something small moved, soft. Alive, forgotten, growing. For years after the Pike Sisters breeding barn was burned down, the people of McDowell County swore the horrors had ended. The chains were cut. The bodies were buried. The barn was ash, but trauma doesn't die where blood has soaked into the soil, and the Pike land kept breathing. It began with Harold Minton, a 62-year-old retired machinist who bought the abandoned plot in 1917. He didn't know the land's history. Outsiders rarely did. The first night he slept in the old farmhouse, he woke to a sound like metal dragging across dirt. At first, he blamed it on wildlife. But the next morning, when he opened the back door, he found a single rust-coated shackle ring lying on the steps. Cold. Freshly dug up, As if the earth had pushed it upward, Harold walked the property, nothing unusual, until he reached the root cellar built into the hillside. Its door was swollen with age. Vines clung to it like fingers. But what froze him was that the padlock, a heavy old iron lock, was snapped open. He hadn't opened it. He hadn't touched it. And yet, it hung loose, swaying lightly, as if someone had just walked inside. Harold pulled the door open. A breath of cold, sour air wafted out. The smell of rot, but also something metallic. The cellar steps groaned under his weight as he descended. Each step felt colder than the last. At the bottom he lit a lantern. The light revealed only shelves. Empty jars. Dry earth, except, in the far corner, half sunken in shadow, was a wooden rocking chair. Old, splintered, and subtly moving, rocking on its own. Harold's breath caught. Then he froze entirely, because on the dirt floor beside the chair was a deep circular groove, carved into the ground, big enough for a human to sit inside. Something about it felt ritualistic, restraining, like it had held someone in place for a long, long time. As Harold stepped closer, the lantern flame thinned, as if oxygen was being sucked out of the room. Then, a whisper, barely sound, more like breath brushing his ear. "Don't open the door again." Harold spun around. No one was there. He backed toward the stairs, but when he looked up, the cellar door was closing, slowly. Deliberately, as if pushed by an unseen hand. He sprinted, slamming into the door just before it shut. He escaped into the daylight, gasping, trembling. That night he couldn't sleep. Every few minutes, something tapped, lightly, rhythmically, against the floorboards beneath his bed. Tap, tap, tap. By dawn, his nerves were shredded. He packed his bags. He didn't care about the money he'd lose. He just wanted off that land. But before leaving, he left a note on the kitchen table for any future owner. A warning. It said, "Do not enter the root cellar. There's a woman down there. She isn't alive, but she isn't gone either." Harold left that morning and never came back. The farmhouse stayed abandoned for decades, and locals still swear that on windless nights you can hear a rocking chair creaking underground, slow, steady, patient, as if something below is waiting for the door to open again. After the Pike Sisters Barn was destroyed and the surviving men were buried, most families in Mercer and McDowell counties tried desperately to move on. But some wounds leave roots deeper than the mountains themselves. One such wound belonged to the Traylor family. Two brothers, Elias, 24, and Mason Traylor, 19, vanished in the summer of 1901, just months before the Pike property was raided. The authorities assumed they had been taken by the sisters, like so many others. The family grieved, mourned, moved on, but they never had bodies to bury. And unanswered grief has a way of festering. In 1925, more than 2 decades later, their nephew Caleb Traylor, a 17-year-old farmhand, became obsessed with the old rumors. The barn was gone, but the land remained. And Caleb wanted closure. Everyone told him, leave the Pike land alone. But teenagers rarely listened to warnings spoken in whispers. The hike to the property, Caleb set out one fog-heavy evening just before dusk, carrying a lantern and a folded piece of paper, a map of old property lines passed down from his grandfather. The forest felt wrong the moment he entered it. The birds were silent. The wind was dead. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. But what bothered Caleb most were the trees. Their trunks were scarred with deep horizontal gouges. Not claw marks, not axe marks. Chains, dragged over and over until the metal bit into the bark. The deeper he walked, the denser those gouges became. And then he found the clearing, a perfect circle in the woods, where grass refused to grow. The place where the barn once stood. Caleb's lantern flickered, though there was no wind. He stepped forward, and the temperature dropped so suddenly his breath turned white. The visitors. In the center of the clearing lay a ring of stones around a patch of disturbed earth, like a grave someone had dug up, then filled in again. Caleb knelt. The soil was soft, recently turned. His pulse quickened. Something was buried there, or unburied and put back. He dug with his hands, frantic, heart hammering. After several minutes, his fingers touched something cold. Metal. He pulled it up. A rusted manacle, broken at the hinge. Then he froze, because whispering began behind him. 2 voices. Male. Soft. Desperate. Caleb? He turned. No one. The trees. The fog. Nothing else. Then the voices came again. Closer. Don't stay. Caleb's entire body locked. Those voices. He'd heard them before. Old phonograph recordings of his great-uncles, played at family gatherings. It was Mason. And Elias. The truth in the ground. Terrified but rooted in place, Caleb whispered, "Where are you?" Silence. Then the ground beneath him shifted. One heavy, subtle ripple like something enormous had pushed upward from below. Caleb scrambled back, stumbling. The earth bulged. Cracked. split open. A hand reached out, not skeletal, not rotted, just wrong. The skin was gray as river clay. The fingers too long, bent, twisted, as if healed incorrectly after being broken dozens of times. A second hand emerged, then an arm, then a face. A face that wasn't human anymore, but behind the distortion, behind the swelling and bruised-looking skin, Caleb saw familiar features. A jawline, cheekbones. His blood went cold. It was Elias. Or what was left of him. The thing struggled out of the earth like a man pulling himself from a grave, except this grave had never truly held him back. Its blind, pale eyes turned toward Caleb. The mouth moved. Dry earth spilled out. Run? Caleb dropped the lantern and bolted for the trees. Behind him, something massive thrashed within the ground, as if multiple bodies were trying to climb up at once. He didn't look back. Not once. Aftermath. Caleb burst into town half delirious and screaming. He was found at sunrise on the porch of the general store, covered in dirt, nails torn, lantern glass embedded in his palm. He never spoke of that night again, but he wrote something in a journal 2 days later before locking the book away. He wrote, "The men weren't killed in the barn. They weren't buried in the forest. They were kept, not by the sisters, not by man, by the land itself, and something under that clearing still wants out." No one in the Trailer family has gone near the Pike property since. Yet hunters, hikers, and trespassers who wander too close to that clearing still report one thing: the sound of hands clawing in the dirt. Slow at first, then frantic, as if something is listening for footsteps and hoping for someone to get close enough to grab. By the time the Pike barn was burned down in 1901, most folks believed the terror had ended, that the sisters, Martha, Luann, and Elise, had been killed or escaped into the mountains. Rumors said they practiced mountain medicine, midwifery, and unspeakable rituals they learned from an old hermit woman in the ridges. But one rumor, barely whispered, claimed something worse. The barn wasn't their only breeding site. Some said the sisters had prepared a second location to continue their work if the first barn was ever discovered. Most dismissed the story as mountain folklore, but in 1933, more than 30 years after the raid, something happened that made the entire county question everything they thought they knew. The return of the screams. During the last week of September, residents of a small mining camp in Crane Valley began hearing screams every night just past midnight. Not animal screams, not drunken fighting. These were male voices, begging, pleading, screaming as if being ripped apart. The miners reported it to Sheriff James Raleigh, but he didn't take it seriously. He called it night echoes and blamed the strange acoustics of the holler. But by the third night, the screams changed. They grew wet, gurgling, choked, as if something was happening to the throats that made them. And on the fourth night, a miner named Lee Harbinger swore he heard 3 female voices speaking over the screams, chanting. He couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. Authority. Control. Commanding obedience, like women who were used to giving orders and having men obey. The discovery of the stone house. One morning, after a particularly vicious night of screaming, a group of miners followed the echoes up the ridge. They climbed until the trees thinned and the air felt colder than it should have been. There, hidden behind overgrown brush, they found it. A stone house built into the hillside, partially buried with no windows. Only a narrow door made from weather-worn oak. But what unsettled them wasn't the house. It was the iron hooks bolted into the rock outside. 5 of them, each spaced a few feet apart, and hanging from the hooks were lengths of old, rusted chain. The same style used in the Pike Sisters Barn. One miner vomited. Lee Harbinger whispered, "Dear God, it's them." The others wanted to go back. Get help. Come with guns. But Lee pushed the door open. The smell hit them first. Stale dirt, blood, rotting wood, and something sweet, metallic and sickening. Candles burned along the walls in jars, casting trembling shadows. Jars filled with herbs, oils, odd trinkets. But the back room, that's where the truth waited. The breeding pit. The miners reached a wide stone chamber carved out of the earth. The ceiling was high. The floor was dirt, and in the center was a deep pit, lined with smoothed rocks and old wooden beams. Grooves in the walls showed where ropes had been tied, hundreds of times over the years. But what froze their blood wasn't the pit. It was what lay at the very bottom. 5 men. Or what used to be men. Their bodies were twisted, limbs elongated unnaturally. Their skin pale and almost waxy. Their eyes wide, unfocused. They were alive, but barely. And when they saw the miners, they tried to crawl up the pit wall, dragging themselves by their fingertips. But they weren't crawling toward rescue. They were crawling to escape, to get away from something behind them. Something in the darkness. Something that hadn't shown itself yet. One man managed to choke out a single word before collapsing. Them. The miners fled. ran faster than they ever had in their lives. Didn't look back. Didn't dare. The sisters' mark. The sheriff didn't believe a word of their story. But when he searched the ridge 2 days later, the stone house was still there. The pit was filled in. Fresh dirt. Some of it still warm. No bodies. No chains. No jars. No candles. Nothing. Only 3 symbols carved into the ash-covered floor with a bone. A vertical line. A circle. A downward arrow. The sigil the Pike sisters used to mark property they considered, quote, claimed. Sheriff Raleigh sealed the ridge, called it a safety hazard, and forbade anyone from going near it again. But the screams? They never stopped. Just after midnight, every few nights, the miners still hear the echoes drifting down from the ridge. Voices crying for help. Men begging to be freed. And beneath those voices, 3 women humming, soft, steady, and patient, as if preparing for something. Something that didn't end in 1901. Something that never ended at all. Something waiting for the right man, the right bloodline to continue what the sisters had started. Some Pike sister legends were exaggerated by gossip, but one tale, whispered only by the oldest families of Crane Valley, was spoken with genuine fear. The sisters didn't hunt victims. They lured them with whistling, a slow, lilting melody that sounded harmless at first, until you realized the tune didn't echo through the woods like normal sound. It moved. It followed you. And in 1914, 13 years after the barn burned, a young coal surveyor named Adam Coulter disappeared trying to find the source of that sound. His journal was found weeks later. But his body was not. The whistling on the South Ridge. Adam Coulter wasn't a superstitious man. He didn't believe in mountain curses or feral witch women. When he heard the miners' wives warn him to stay off the South Ridge, he laughed it off. "You'll hear the whistles if you go far enough," old Mrs. Reeves told him. "And once you hear it 3 times, there's no turning back." Adam smirked. "Ma'am, I've been all through the Appalachians. I don't scare easy." On October 2nd, Adam hiked toward the ridge with his survey tools, notebook, and lunch wrapped in wax paper. At noon, he wrote, "Heard a bird call that sounded almost musical. Odd. At 1:17 p.m. Whistling again. Not a bird. Faint. Almost human. At 2:05 p.m. It's behind me. But when I turn, nothing." That was the last entry he wrote in daylight. The first night. Figures in the tree line. Adam built a small fire and tried to convince himself he was just tired. Around 11:40 p.m. he wrote hurriedly, "Whistle again. Closer." 3 notes. Descending. At 12:18 a.m. Saw shadows. 3 shapes between the trees. Moving slowly. At 12:37 a.m. The fire keeps going dim even though I fed it. Something is blocking the air. He scratched a final note before the page ripped. "I know they're women, but they don't move like humans." The second day, their eyes were wrong. Adam tried to leave at dawn, but the woods didn't look the same. Paths he had marked were gone. Rocks he'd passed earlier were in different places, and the sun felt too weak, as if the light itself was being filtered. At 10:49 a.m. he wrote, "Saw the women clearly. 3 of them. They stood at the ravine, watching me." He described them in short, jagged lines. Hair too long, dragging in the leaves. Skin pale enough to reflect light. Eyes black, no white at all. Mouths too wide, like the corners had been cut. Their dresses looked handmade, stained with mud and something darker. And then, they opened their mouths. The whistle came out. But their lips didn't move. Adam dropped the journal right after that entry. Ink smudged across the page as if he'd snapped the book shut and ran. The abandoned camp. 3 weeks later, rescue parties found Adam's abandoned campsite. The fire was cold, his tools untouched, his pack half open, but the journal was resting neatly on a stump, as if someone had placed it there with care. Near it, on the ground, were 3 sets of footprints. All bare, all smaller than an average woman's foot. But here's what chilled the rescuers. Each footprint had 6 toes. The last page, written by someone else. The last page of Adam's journal wasn't written in his handwriting. It was written in a large, looping, elegant script, the kind used in 1800s family Bibles. It read, "He followed the whistle. He answered the call. The ridge has claimed him. One more father for the brood." Below it were 3 symbols, the same Pike Sister sigils found in the stone house decades later. A vertical line. A circle. A downward arrow. In dried brown ink, or what the sheriff believed was ink, the whistling never stopped. The journal was locked in the sheriff's office, but miners said they still heard the whistling on the ridge. Always in threes. Always descending notes. Always moving toward anyone who dared listen too long. By 1925, 5 more men were missing. Locals stopped going near the ridge entirely. Even today, hikers swear they hear it. A soft, breathy whistle drifting through the trees. Never too close, never too far. Just enough to make you turn around. Just enough to make you wonder who's watching. And why they want you to follow. When the Pike Sisters Barn burned in 1901, locals believed the nightmare had ended. But the truth was this: the barn was never the origin. It was only the doorway. The real beginning lay deeper in the mountains, buried beneath a ridge so remote even trappers avoided it. Blackwater Ridge. And in 1926, a group of loggers accidentally uncovered something that should have stayed hidden forever. A stone altar older than any settlement in West Virginia. An altar that matched the symbols found in the Pike Sisters' journals, and one that looked freshly used. The discovery: the Blackwater Logging Company was clearing a path for a new road. On August 14th, their foreman, Wade Hallstrom, noticed a strange rock formation near the tree line, a slab too smooth to be natural, too flat to be random. When they pulled away the brush covering it, the loggers found a waist-high stone table, a carved basin at the center, 3 spirals etched around the edges, old iron rings bolted into the ground, and the most disturbing sight: claw marks dug deep into the stone, as if someone or something had tried to hold on while being dragged across it. The men joked nervously at first. "Old hunting altar," one said. "Moonshiner nonsense," another muttered. But the joking stopped the moment Wade lifted a loose slab beside the altar. Underneath was a cavity. Inside it lay bones. Not animal bones. Human bones. 37 of them. The same number of men who vanished during the Pike Sisters' reign. What the bones showed: the sheriff brought in Dr. Russell Kramer, a medical examiner from Elkins. His findings were unsettling. The bones belonged mostly to men aged 18 to 45. All had similar fractures in the wrists and ankles. Most had elongated finger bones, as if the joints had been repeatedly strained. Nearly all had faint tool marks near the pelvis and spine. And one skull, the only complete one, had scratches on the inside, as if the person had tried to claw their way out of something before death. Kramer's official conclusion was vague. Likely ritualistic. Likely deliberate, possibly connected to pre-settlement practices. Unofficially, he told the sheriff something else: these bones didn't belong to ordinary men. Their bodies were altered. The sheriff didn't ask how. He didn't want to know. The 3 shadows at the tree line. 2 days later, while crews took photographs and measurements, Wade Hallstrom noticed 3 figures standing beyond the clearing. They were motionless, tall, thin, dressed in what looked like tattered dresses. He shouted at them. They didn't move. He walked closer, and the figures retreated into the woods at the exact same pace he advanced. 3 steps back, perfectly synchronized. When he stopped, they stopped. When he turned away, he heard it. A soft, breathy whistle. 3 notes. Descending. The same whistle heard on the South Ridge in episode 12. The same whistle tied to every Pike Sister disappearance. Wade abandoned the investigation within minutes. He quit his job the next morning. The blood in the basin. Before the altar could be properly removed, a storm slammed the ridge. Lightning struck trees. Mudslides formed. The logging crew retreated. When they returned the next day, the basin at the center of the altar was filled, not with rainwater, with dark, thick fluid that tested positive for human blood. Fresh blood. Blood from multiple donors. The sheriff ordered the ridge sealed off permanently, but it was too late, because the discovery had awakened something that had waited for decades. The return of the whistling. Throughout the fall of 1926, residents across the valley reported strange sounds. Whistling outside bedroom windows. Footsteps in the woods stopping whenever someone looked outside. Scratching on back doors at night. Soft breathing heard at the edge of fields. Long strands of hair found on fence posts. Hunters found tracks, bare footprints with 6 toes, always in sets of 3. And one night, a farmer swore he saw 3 women standing in his pasture. Tall, pale, hair swinging like wet ropes. Faces blank except for huge black eyes. They watched him for several minutes. Then, one of them opened her mouth. But the whistle came from behind him instead. When he spun around, nothing was there. When he turned back, so were they. The altar vanishes. By spring 1927, the logging company finally sent a crew to remove the altar stone. When they reached the clearing, it was gone. No stone, no bones, no iron rings, no carvings, no evidence anyone had ever been there. Only an enormous circular patch of dead grass. And in the center, 3 strands of hair, braided together. People whispered that the Pike Sisters had reclaimed what belonged to them. that the altar was never a man-made structure, that it was alive, and that it moved on its own when threatened. The legend that followed. Today, hikers in Blackwater Ridge report an eerie sensation, a pressure on the chest, a change in air temperature, a sound like distant singing, a feeling like they're being measured, evaluated, claimed. Some say the altar still exists, but only appears to those chosen. Men who walk the ridge alone, men who hear the whistles, men who feel the pine trees leaning a little too close, and if they follow that sound long enough, they never come back. By 1931, the Pike sisters had been dead for 3 decades, at least according to every official record, but in the mountains, death was never the end. And in Blackwater Hollow, people whispered that the sisters did not truly die. They simply returned to the woods they were born from, and those woods had begun choosing new victims. The first vanishing. On April 3, 1931, a coal miner named Thomas Grady vanished while hiking home through the ridge after a night of drinking. His footprints led straight into the forest, then stopped abruptly. No sign of struggle, no blood, no clothing, no drag marks, just one handprint on a nearby tree. A woman's handprint, long-fingered, sharp-nailed, pressed so deeply into the bark it left a permanent scar. Locals recognized that mark immediately. Not human, not natural, not new. The sheriff organized a search by daylight, but by dusk, every man returned shaken. They all said the same thing: we were being followed. The whispering eyes. Throughout April, more men reported bizarre encounters in the woods, seeing eyes glowing from behind tree trunks, hearing female whispering echoing in the branches, feeling cold fingers brush their necks, smelling wet hair, like something had stood behind them seconds earlier. One man, a trapper named Ryland Moore, refused to go back into the forest ever again after what he saw. While checking snares, he noticed 3 thin shapes perched in the trees above him. Silent, motionless, heads cocked at identical angles. Their skin was pale and stretched, like something starved. Their hair hung in long, stringy ropes. Their arms were too long, elbows bending wrong, and all 3 smiled, slowly. In perfect unison, Ryland ran without collecting his traps. When he reached home, he couldn't stop shaking. His final words before moving out of the county were, "They weren't watching me. They were deciding if I was worth taking." The forest that breathed. In May, a young schoolteacher named Evan Mallory went missing. He was quiet, polite, and always took the same path home. When he didn't show up to work, neighbors searched his route. They found something disturbing. The trees around the path were bent inward, forming a tunnel-like shape, as if they'd grown overnight into a rib cage. Some branches had long strands of black hair tangled in them, fresh. Still damp. At the end of the bent trees, the searchers found Evan's boots, placed neatly side by side, facing the forest. A footprint path led deeper in, but only 3 sets of prints followed him, barefoot, adult-sized, 6-toed. The loggers heard singing. By summer, Blackwater Ridge became a place people feared to mention. The stillness wasn't natural. The forest seemed to be watching. A group of loggers cutting near the slope reported something chilling. A woman's voice singing from deep within the woods. Soft, slow, melodic, a lullaby carried by the wind. But when the men walked toward the sound, it shifted behind them. Always behind. Then the singing stopped, replaced by a low, playful whistle. 3 notes. Descending. The same whistle connected to every Pike sister case. The same whistle described by the 37 missing men found beneath the stone altar. The same whistle heard outside cabin windows for decades. The loggers abandoned the site that evening. 2 quit entirely. The return of the offering. On September 17th, just as the first leaf fall began, a hunter stumbled upon something tied to a spruce tree. A bundle of sticks, wrapped in braided black hair, decorated with shards of bone. And inside the bundle, a human tongue. On its surface was carved a crude spiral, the symbol found repeatedly in the sisters' journals, clothing, and in the stone altar basin. The sheriff sealed the area, but word got out. The Pike sisters were taking victims again. And this time, the forest itself was helping them. The screams from the hollow. By October, hunters reported hearing men screaming from Blackwater Hollow. Not short cries, not yells. Long, drawn-out screams that rose and fell, echoing through the valley. But no one could locate the source. The screams would start close, then fade miles away, then appear from above as if coming from the treetops. One hunter swore the screams weren't of pain, but of someone being pulled, dragged across earth, pleading breathlessly. "Stop. Please, stop." Until it ended in wet choking. When the hunter tried to report it, the sheriff said, "Don't go back. Don't listen. And if you hear whistling, run." The 3 shapes at the ridge. On November 3rd, a thick fog rolled into the valley. By noon, visibility was barely 10 feet. A A farmer walking his mule spotted 3 silhouettes standing on the ridge above him, tall, thin, hair hanging to their waists, heads tilting in unnatural angles. He couldn't see their faces, just their outlines. All 3 raised their arms at the same time. All 3 pointed toward him, and all 3 opened their mouths. But no sound came out. Instead, the trees behind him began whispering. He ran home, abandoning the mule. By morning, the mule was found dead. Not eaten, not torn apart, but drained. Every drop of blood gone. The woods close in. The final confirmed missing person of 1931 was Peter Mallard, a surveyor. His last journal entry, found near a collapsed area of brush, read, "3 women in the woods. Watching. I think they want me to follow." Tracks showed he walked willingly for a half-mile. Then the footprints split. Peter's tracks continued forward, but on both sides, 3 sets of barefoot prints suddenly appeared, as if the women had risen straight from the ground. Peter's tracks ended at the edge of a ravine. No body, no sign he fell. Just one thing left behind, a perfect triangle carved into the dirt, the symbol of selection from the Pike journals. After that final disappearance, the county declared the region cursed. Families moved away. Roads were abandoned, and Blackwater Ridge returned to silence, except for the occasional whistle drifting through the trees, reminding everyone the sisters were still choosing, still watching, still waiting for the next man to walk too close. The strangest part about the Pike sisters' case wasn't the barn, or the chains, or even the stories whispered for more than a century. It was the survivor. Only one man ever escaped that place alive. A man the newspapers briefly mentioned, then quietly erased from history. His name was Elias Ward, a 24-year-old railroad mechanic who vanished in the fall of 1900. For 121 years, nobody knew what happened to him after he returned. Until now. Because this is the part of the story the authorities never wanted people to hear. Elias didn't remember escaping. He remembered waking up. He said he opened his eyes on the cold floor of a stranger's house, not in the Pike barn, not in the woods, but inside some decaying mountain cabin that smelled like wet ash. His wrists were torn raw. His ankles were bleeding. But the chains were gone. He stumbled to his feet, dizzy, and wandered outside to find help, only to realize he wasn't alone. Someone had been watching over him. Someone who stayed hidden. Someone who left no footprints. Elias told investigators that every night, just after sundown, he heard the cabin's porch creak. But every time he opened the door, no one was there. Just the sound of breathing. Deep, slow, patient breathing drifting from the tree line. At first, Elias thought it was one of the sisters. But the sound was too low. Too animal. Too hungry. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hurt him. It was guarding him. The nightmares started next. Elias said he dreamed of the barn every night. The sisters moving through the dark like shadows, the walls covered in something he couldn't describe. Men whispering in the dark, begging him not to leave them behind. But the worst part? He didn't dream as himself. He dreamed as one of the Pike sisters. He felt their hands. He saw through their eyes. He heard their thoughts. Cold, calculating, eerily united. Elias claimed the sisters weren't 3 people. They were one mind split into 3 bodies. A single will moving through multiple vessels. When he told the sheriff this, they dismissed him as traumatized. But the details he described, the room placements, the back tunnels, the hidden cellar, matched perfectly with the barn investigators had found months later. There was no possible way he should have known any of that, not unless he truly saw it. Then came the incident. One night in early spring, with the snow melting outside the cabin, Elias woke to the sound of footsteps circling the walls. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if someone was pulling a heavy sack. He hid behind the broken bed frame, heart pounding in his throat. Then, a whisper. Not a woman's voice. Not the sheriff, not the wind, but a distorted, cracked voice that sounded like 3 voices layered together. "You were supposed to stay." Elias ran. He sprinted through the trees barefoot, branches slashing at his legs, lungs burning. Behind him, the voice echoed through the forest. Closer, then farther, then suddenly right beside his ear. Not chasing, mocking, laughing. He ran until the world blurred, until he collapsed onto a dirt road, where a group of miners found him shaking and half-conscious. He begged them, "Don't let them take me back." The miners didn't understand. Not until they saw the scratches up and down his back. Not claw marks, not human, but long, parallel marks like he had been dragged across the floor. Marks fresh enough that the blood was still wet. Elias was moved into state custody and disappeared the next morning. The room was locked from the inside. No windows broken. No door forced. Just Elias's bedsheets curled neatly at the foot of the bed, and a single muddy footprint on the wooden floor. 3 toes. Not 5. 3. The same number investigators found burned into the Pike barn walls after the fire. The case file was sealed and buried. Elias's family never got answers. And locals say that on foggy nights in the West Virginia hills, you can still hear 3 voices whispering from the woods, calling for the one who got away. Calling him home. The news of the Pike Sisters Barn sent shockwaves through West Virginia. Newspapers tried printing pieces of the truth, but within 48 hours every article vanished. Every editor who had dared to publish details suddenly printed retractions claiming the story was exaggerated, unverified, or sensationalized. But the locals knew. They had seen the U.S. Marshals arrive at 2 a.m. They had seen the government wagons hauling crates of sealed evidence out of the barn before sunrise. And they had heard the men screaming from inside those crates. Most disturbing of all, the barn was burned down by noon the next day, not by the townspeople, not by angry families, but by the authorities themselves. The official statement? A safety measure due to structural instability. But every local who watched the barn collapse into flames whispered the same thing. They weren't destroying a building. They were destroying what was inside it. Inside the government facility where the remaining survivors were taken, doctors and psychologists were sworn to silence. But one nurse, an older woman named Mrs. Harland, spoke in a letter she wrote before she died. Those men weren't just abused. They were changed. Their eyes, they weren't human anymore. Some couldn't speak. Some refused to sleep because they said the sisters whispered under their eyelids. The nurse mentioned something else, something she begged never to be published. When the crates of evidence were opened in the hospital basement, the staff found rusted chains thicker than wrists, leather restraints with deep claw marks, small glass jars with preserved fetuses in deformed, inhuman shapes, and a locked iron book, its pages made of thin, stretched leather. Every nurse, doctor, and guard who touched the iron book reported the same thing: a smell of rotting earth and the sound of women breathing behind them, even though the room was empty. Within a week, the book was taken away for national security analysis. No one saw it again. But the strangest part? As the barn remains burned, the ground around it never cooled. People claimed you could walk near the ashes at midnight and see 3 silhouettes of women, standing in a row, facing the woods, as if waiting. When Sheriff Collins protested the cover-up and demanded charges be filed against the Pike sisters' extended family, the state forced him to resign. His replacement, a timid man with shaking hands, signed the papers without reading them. Every surviving man was relocated under new identities. Families were told they had run off, or recovered and moved west. But the truth? Most were never seen again. Some people believed the government was hiding the depravity of the Pike sisters. But others, especially the old families in the Ozarks, believed something else entirely. The Pike sisters were not a crime story. They were a ritual, and whatever they were trying to birth, the government didn't want anyone to know how close they came to succeeding. The town stayed silent. The officials stayed silent. But deep inside the ashes of the barn, buried under the dirt, the old iron book had left behind a single, burnt page. On it was scrawled one sentence in a language no one recognized, except one historian who translated it before disappearing forever. The mothers do not die. They only wait. If the Pike sisters were truly gone, why did locals keep seeing 3 long shadows walking along the fence line at dawn? The ashes of the Pike sisters' barn had barely cooled when the sightings began. Not in the deep woods. Not near the river. But along a ridge that overlooked the old homestead, a place the townspeople had avoided for decades, even before the barn was exposed. At first, it was just whispers. A hunter returning before sunrise saw 3 thin silhouettes standing perfectly still on the ridge, dresses fluttering in a wind he couldn't feel. A teenage girl walking her dog saw them at dusk, unmoving, heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. By the time the 3rd sighting was reported, almost everyone knew. The Pike sisters were still there, but these weren't ghosts. Ghosts flicker. Ghosts drift. Ghosts vanish when you blink. These figures did none of that. They were solid, black against the sky, watching something below them. Always the same direction, the remains of their barn. Every witness described the exact same thing. 3 women, standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing the same point. None moving, always appearing right before dawn. Some described them as tall. Others said unnaturally thin. But everyone agreed on one detail. Their heads turned slowly, to follow anyone who passed. The sheriff, new, scared, and completely unprepared, sent 2 deputies up the ridge to check it out. They radioed in as they climbed. Everything seemed normal. They joked nervously. One said he'd bring back 3 spinsters with a taste for drama. Then, the radio distorted. The static drowned them. A scream cut through. And then silence. 20 minutes later, they were found wandering downhill alone. No memory of what happened, no sign of the sisters, eyes bloodshot as if they'd been shown something they never wanted to see. One deputy quit the next day. The other simply said, "They aren't gone. They're just waiting for the right night." And that's when the townspeople realized something chilling. The sightings always happened when the moon was thin, when the sky was blackest, and when the air smelled faintly of cold iron, the same metallic scent that once seeped from the barn doors. The local pastor began preaching that the sisters were unfinished evil, that burning the barn destroyed only their bodies, not their purpose. Old mountain folk had another theory. The Pike sisters had tied their souls to the land through something ancient, older than the town, older than the ridgeline, older than the first cabins ever built there. A blood-binding ritual, one that allowed them to remain where they died, rooted to the soil, feeding off the fear of those who spoke their name. Some nights, travelers saw lantern lights on the ridge, 3 dim glows bobbing in the dark, moving in slow circles, like women searching for something in the dirt. Other nights, dogs in the valley howled until their throats went dry, refusing to look in the direction of the ridge. Then, one night, everything changed. A farmer named Eli Proctor, drunk and furious at the idea of ghost women scaring his livestock, drove his wagon straight toward the ridge. With a shotgun in hand, he marched through the brush, cursing them, daring them to appear. What happened next, no one could explain. The neighbors heard him screaming, not words, but raw, primal terror. By the time they found him, Eli was crawling back down the ridge, face gray, eyes wide, repeating the same sentence over and over like a broken record. "They ain't shadows. Shadows don't breathe." When the men fetched lanterns and climbed the ridge themselves, the air was freezing cold. They found Eli's footprints, but alongside them, pressed into the dirt, were 3 sets of bare footprints. Long, bony, unmistakably human, yet frozen into the ground as if the soil had iced over instantly under their steps. And at the very top of the ridge, they found something else. A small wooden doll, hand-carved, dressed in a fabric scrap identical to the Pike sisters' dresses. Inside the doll's chest was a hollow space, and within it, wrapped in old twine, was a human tooth. The town buried it at once, but by morning, the doll was back on the ridge, this time with 2 teeth inside. The Pike sisters weren't haunting the ridge. They were marking it, preparing it, guarding something beneath it. The ridge had always been strange. People used to say the soil felt wrong beneath your boots, too soft, too warm, too alive. But no one expected the truth hiding beneath it. The morning after the wooden doll reappeared, now holding 2 human teeth, the town council ordered a group of men to dig up whatever's under there. Not because they were brave, but because fear makes people reckless. 5 men went up the ridge with shovels, lanterns, and the shaky confidence of people pretending not to be terrified. The air grew colder with each step. Not mountain cold. Dead cold. A cold that settled into their lungs, slowing their breath, tightening their skin. They reached the center of the ridge, the exact spot where all 3 Pike sisters had always been seen standing shoulder to shoulder. The soil there was darker than the rest. Not from moisture. More like ash. Like something had been burned deep beneath it long before the barn ever existed. They stuck their shovels in, and the earth moved under the first strike. Not like dirt. Like something shifting just below the surface, as if it had been waiting. The men hesitated, exchanging glances. But pride, superstition, and anger pushed them on. The second strike hit something solid. Not metal, not bone. Wood. They cleared the soil quickly. Within minutes, a buried slab emerged, a wooden platform reinforced with rusted iron bands carved with symbols none of the men recognized. Symbols that seemed crude and primitive, yet deliberate. Old mountain markings. Older than Appalachia itself. Something about the slab made their lantern flames flicker, shrinking into trembling pinpoints. The ridge had gone utterly silent. No wind, no birds, no insects. Only breathing. And then, a sound from beneath the slab. Slow, wet, dragging, like flesh sliding across stone. One of the younger men panicked and swung his shovel, splintering a corner of the slab. A sour smell burst out, heavy, rotten, but distinctly animal and human. A hybrid stench that made the men gag. Another crack split across the wood. The slab began to bow outward from internal pressure. Something underneath was pushing up. The men stepped back instinctively, raising their lanterns. The surface bulged. The iron bands groaned. The symbols seemed to shift, like they were reacting to what was waking beneath them. A whispering wind rose, but none of their lantern flames moved. The wind wasn't outside. It was coming from the cracks. The younger man dropped his shovel, grabbed by a primitive instinct telling him to run. But before he could, the slab burst open with a violent crack, spewing out a cloud of dust and a shower of wooden shards. Below it was a pit. A deep, narrow shaft carved by hand, disappearing into absolute darkness. And from that darkness, something breathed. A slow inhale. A rattling exhale. Not a creature. Not a human. Something in between. Something that should not have been alive. The men froze. Every instinct in their bodies screamed to flee. But none could move. Their lantern light barely reached the bottom, but it illuminated enough. Claw marks. Deep ones. Carved into the stone walls. And lower still. Shackles. Chains. Bones. Some broken. Some fresh. Then, they saw the hand. A long, pale arm reached up from the darkness, thin as rope, joints bulging, fingers far too long. It wasn't reaching for them. It was feeling the air. Feeling freedom. Testing it. Something below followed the arm upward. Something larger, shifting, scraping, unfolding. The oldest man finally snapped out of the trance and yelled, "Put the damn slab back!" But they couldn't. It had exploded outward, shattered into fragments. And as the creature, or whatever remained of it, began pulling itself upward, the ground trembled. A vibration rolled beneath the ridge like a heartbeat. Behind them, far back in the tree line, 3 thin silhouettes appeared. The Pike Sisters. Watching. Silent. As if witnessing the birth of something they had spent their lives feeding, protecting, and hiding. The men fled, stumbling down the ridge, leaving their tools, their lanterns, their sanity behind. Only one looked back. He wished he hadn't, because he saw the 3 sisters step closer to the pit, arms raised, in a posture not of fear, but worship. The thing in the pit was theirs, and now it was waking. The men who fled the ridge didn't sleep that night. Didn't speak. Didn't drink. Didn't even remove their boots. They just sat in their homes, trembling, waiting for someone, anyone, to knock on their door and tell them what to do. Nobody did, because while the men hid inside, the Pike Sisters were already preparing the ridge. At dusk, a thick fog rolled down from the mountain. Dense, milky, unnatural. The kind that muffled sound and swallowed lantern light. People in town closed their shutters. Animals retreated under porches. Even the stray dogs stopped barking. From the fog came whispers, soft, feminine, perfectly in harmony. 3 voices. Humming. Chanting. Or coaxing. No one wanted to admit it, but the town had always wondered whether the sisters were born here, or born from something here, because their voices never sounded quite human. At the ridge, the broken slab still lay in splinters. The pit breathed. A hot, wet exhale rising up in waves that smelled like a slaughterhouse left in the sun. The sisters stood at its edge, barefoot, dresses dirty, hands clasped as if in prayer, faces calm, almost joyous. They leaned forward slightly, as though listening to something deep in the earth. And then, it climbed, not fast, not slow, just climbing with the certainty of something that knew it couldn't be stopped. A hand surfaced first. Not the thin, pale one the men had seen, but a second hand, thicker, slick with mud, bones strangely bent. Then the head, not human, not animal, something malformed, misshapen, like a skull that had been cracked and reassembled wrong. It didn't look at the sisters. It didn't look at the sky. It didn't look at anything. It listened. The ridge went quiet, and the humming stopped. For the first time, the sisters spoke aloud. "You're awake," Lydia Pike whispered. "We kept you fed. We kept you hidden. We kept the bloodline alive." Bloodline. That was the word the townsfolk always whispered, the one that made marriages break and families move. But this wasn't about incest. This wasn't about breeding. It was about offspring. The sisters weren't protecting their father, or their lovers, or the men they dragged into the barn. They were protecting what came from those men. The thing in the pit was their creation. It wasn't born. It was assembled, piece by piece, blood by blood, generation by generation. It dragged itself fully into the lantern glow, and for a moment, the forest seemed to recoil. Its spine was twisted like rusted metal. Its ribs stuck out like broken branches. Its arms were too long, too thin, trembling under its own weight. Its mouth stretched across its face, like someone tried to carve a smile into a corpse. But the worst part, the part that made people lose their minds later when they heard the story, was its eyes. They weren't monstrous. They weren't glowing. They weren't empty. They were human. Several of them, embedded along the sides of its head. All different colors. All blinking. All looking in different directions. All crying, the sisters stepped closer, completely unafraid. "You're hungry," Mary said. "We'll bring them," Abigail added. "Just like before," Lydia finished. The creature twitched, then stood, and when it rose to full height, the ridge itself seemed to tilt. It towered. 7, maybe 8 feet, shaking violently with each breath. Then, it turned its head toward town. Not because it smelled people, but because it heard the heartbeat of the men who had run. The sisters smiled, because this was what they had been waiting for. "This time," Lydia whispered, "you feast on all of them." The creature took its first step, a deep, thunderous stomp that cracked the soil. Then another, and another. Fog swallowed it as it walked downhill, massive silhouette drifting like a nightmare carving its way into the waking world. The Pike sisters followed, graceful, silent, devoted. Back in town, the first lantern flickered, the first dog whimpered, the first window pane vibrated, and the first scream, a man's, echoed from the edge of the woods. The barn was breathing, not like an old wooden building settling on a cold night. No. This felt alive, like something under the floorboards still moved, still watched, still waited. Caleb opened his lantern one last time. This was the deepest part of the farm, the section even the Pike sisters didn't bring victims into until the very end. A long, narrow hallway carved beneath the barn, where the smell of iron mixed with something far worse. He'd found 37 men so far. Some alive, some barely human, some who begged him to kill them instead of helping them escape. But there was one last door, a rusted iron slab with scratch marks all over it. Something inside had been trying to get out for decades. Caleb whispered to himself, "If I don't open this, no one ever will." The hallway went still. Even the chained men behind him stopped sobbing. They stared at that door like it held the devil himself. The final room. The hinges screamed as the iron door cracked open. Inside, only a single lantern hung from a nail. And in the center of the room, a bed. A massive, reinforced iron bed bolted to the ground. Chains thicker than Caleb's wrists wrapped around the frame. But what froze his blood wasn't the bed. It was the figure sitting beside it. A woman, tall, pale, hair hanging like wet rope. Her dress still stained with the same dark patches the Pike sisters were infamous for. She wasn't one of the victims. She was one of them, the last Pike sister, and she had never left. Her voice snapped through the silence. "You're late. We've been waiting for our final breeder." Caleb stepped back, but the door slammed shut behind him. The lantern flickered, and the woman stood up. The real truth of the barn. All these years, people believed the Pike sisters kidnapped men to use as breeding stock. But the truth was darker. The sisters weren't trying to create children. They were trying to create something else, something their diseased bloodline had worshipped since the early 1800s. A perfect hybrid. Half human, half whatever they were becoming. The last sister smiled, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. "You've freed the others, but you won't leave." The room began to rot around him. Boards twisted. Chains rattled. Something moved under the bed. Large, heavy, breathing in long, horrible gulps. Caleb backed up to the wall, heart slamming. He wasn't getting out. Not alive. Candle the final scream. The creature under the bed crawled out. Long limbs. Double joints. Skin pale as milk. Eyes black as coal. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a woman. It was what the Pike sisters had been trying to create for 3 generations. And it was hungry. The last thing anyone heard was Caleb's scream as the lantern fell and shattered. Then darkness. Epilogue. What they found. 2 days later, authorities finally raided the Pike farm. The 37 surviving men were rescued. Barely clinging to life. But Caleb, he was gone. No body, no blood, no footprints leaving the barn. Only one thing was found. The giant iron bed in the final room had fresh chains on it, and one new scratch mark on the wall. Deep, frantic, desperate, like someone had clawed at the wood until their fingers broke. Some stories don't fade with time, they stain it. The tale of the Pike sisters is one of those scars, a reminder that the worst monsters are often the ones who look human. The screams trapped inside that rotting barn, the chains rusted into the dirt, the 37 lives stolen and broken, all of it still lingers like a shadow stretched across West Virginia's history. If you listen this far, then you've walked through darkness and survived. But remember, evil leaves footprints. And some of them never stop moving. Thank you for watching Forgotten Remains. If you want more disturbing stories buried under dust and silence, subscribe, because we're not done digging yet. Until next time, keep your lights on. Keep your doors locked. And whatever you do, don't ignore the sounds coming from old barns.